The lecture hall buzzed with quiet whispers as students settled in, notebooks open, ready for another grueling calculus session. At the front, a professor smirked, eyes scanning the room, until they locked onto an older man sitting in the back, Clint Eastwood. The legendary actor and director, known for his tough demeanor, sat calmly, observing. The professor's grin widened. "Mr. Eastwood, since you're here, why don't you solve this equation?" He scribbled a mind-boggling calculus problem on the board, turning to the class with a knowing smirk. Chuckles rippled through the room. A Hollywood star against advanced mathematics? This would be entertaining. But Clint Eastwood wasn't just any man. He slowly stood, eyes sharp as ever. What happened next would leave everyone stunned. Stay until the end, because this wasn't just about math. It was about respect, humility, and a lesson no one saw coming. Before we get into today's story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now let's get started. The air in the lecture hall was thick with the scent of old books and dry erase markers. Rows of students hunched over their desks, the soft rustling of papers and muffled coughs breaking the silence. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow over the sea of young faces, all eager or dreading the lesson ahead. Among them, a man sat near the back, silent, composed. Clint Eastwood. He wasn't here for a spectacle. He wasn't here to prove anything. He had simply wandered into the lecture hall out of curiosity, his sharp eyes scanning the equations scribbled on the board. Numbers and symbols danced in precise formations, but they weren't intimidating to him. Not yet. The professor, a wiry man with thick-rimmed glasses and an air of superiority, paced at the front, relishing the attention of his audience. He lived for these moments where he could flex his intellectual muscles, reminding his students who was in charge. But today, he had a different target. His eyes flickered toward Clint, his lips curling ever so slightly. Clint remained still, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk. He had dealt with arrogance before. He had seen men underestimate him. Hollywood had its share of egos, and life had taught him how to deal with them. But this was different. This wasn't a film set. This was academia, where men like the professor held the illusion of power, using their knowledge as a weapon rather than a tool. A faint murmur swept through the students as they too noticed Clint's presence. Whispers, stolen glances. Some smirked, likely thinking, "What's he doing here?" Others seemed genuinely intrigued. Clint caught a few eyes before they quickly turned away. He had spent a lifetime being watched, judged, measured against expectations. This was nothing new. The professor cleared his throat dramatically, silencing the room. "Before we begin today's lesson," he said, eyes locked on Clint, "we have an unexpected guest. Mr. Eastwood, I assume you didn't come here to discuss film theory?" A few students chuckled. Clint didn't move. He simply raised an eyebrow, waiting. The professor smirked. "Tell me, sir, do you know anything about calculus?" A pause. The tension in the air thickened. Clint finally leaned forward, his voice low and measured. "Depends," he said. "Are you asking because you want to teach, or just to show off?" A ripple of gasps and chuckles ran through the students. The professor stiffened. He hadn't expected a response like that. Outside, the late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Inside, the real storm was about to begin. The room fell into a thick silence, the kind that stretches just long enough to make people uneasy. The professor's smirk twitched at the edges, his pride momentarily rattled by Clint's calm yet cutting response. But he wasn't about to let some Hollywood legend steal his stage. No, not in his classroom. "Well," the professor said, chuckling dryly, "I suppose that depends on whether you can handle a real intellectual challenge. Let's put that confidence to the test, shall we?" He turned to the board, marker in hand, and with a flourish began scribbling down an equation. Not just any equation, a monstrous, multivariable calculus problem stretching across the board in looping symbols and numbers. The students leaned forward, some exchanging wide-eyed glances. Even they knew this wasn't just a problem, it was a challenge, a gauntlet thrown at Clint's feet. The professor stepped back, admiring his work. Then, with mock innocence, he turned to Clint. "Since you seem so sure of yourself, why don't you give it a try?" A murmur rippled through the students. Some grinned, eager to see how this would unfold. Others shook their heads, already convinced of the outcome. Clint Eastwood, doing calculus? It was laughable. But Clint, he didn't flinch. Slowly, he stood up. The chair scraped against the floor, the sound sharp in the dead silent room. He walked toward the board with deliberate, measured steps, his boots clicking softly against the tile. The professor folded his arms, waiting, confident that this was where the old actor would falter. Clint stared at the equation. A lesser man might have hesitated, might have let doubt creep in under the weight of dozens of eyes watching, waiting for failure. But Clint, he simply tilted his head slightly, running his fingers across his chin, as if studying an old blueprint. The professor sighed, dramatically. "Of course, if it's too complicated, I understand. This level of math isn't exactly for—" Clint picked up the marker. The professor stopped mid-sentence. Clint's hand moved across the board, not hesitantly, not in confusion, but with precision. The room held its collective breath as he worked, each stroke of the marker smooth, confident. The murmurs died down. Even the professor's smirk began to waver. A few students leaned in, eyes widening. They recognized what was happening before the professor did. Clint wasn't struggling, he wasn't guessing, he was solving it. With one final mark, Clint underlined his answer and stepped back. He capped the marker with a soft click, then turned to face the professor, eyes steady, expression unreadable. The professor blinked, his lips parting slightly as if his brain was struggling to catch up with what had just happened. One brave student in the back whispered, "Holy—" He actually did it. The professor's jaw tightened. He turned quickly to the board, scanning Clint's work, searching for an error, any mistake, something to salvage his wounded pride. But there was none. The answer was correct, perfect even. Clint dusted his hands off. "I don't like to waste time talking," he said coolly. "I prefer action." The tension in the room cracked like thunder. Some students gasped. Others grinned, nudging their friends. The professor, now red-faced, clenched his jaw. Clint didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He simply turned and walked back to his seat, leaving the professor standing there, silent, stunned, humiliated. The balance of power in the room had just shifted. The professor's face twitched, his confidence cracking like a thin layer of ice under the weight of Clint's quiet competence. The room, once filled with stifled chuckles at Clint's expense, was now dead silent. The students, wide-eyed and alert, glanced between their professor and the Hollywood icon who had just defied every expectation. But the professor wasn't done. No, he couldn't be. His authority had just been challenged in front of his students, and his ego wouldn't allow him to back down. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, forcing a smirk back onto his face. "Impressive, but let's be honest, that was just a warm-up. Anyone can memorize formulas." A few nervous chuckles scattered through the room, but they lacked the enthusiasm from before. The students weren't so sure anymore. The professor turned back to the board, erasing Clint's flawless solution with more force than necessary. His movements were sharp, frustrated. Then he took a deep breath and began writing again, this time with even more elaborate symbols, pushing the limits of calculus, embedding concepts only a trained mathematician would understand. The problem stretched across the board, sprawling like an intricate puzzle of chaos and complexity. This wasn't just difficult, it was brutal. The kind of problem only a specialist would dare attempt. The professor stepped back, capping his marker with a smug flick of his wrist. "There," he said, turning toward Clint. "Let's see how you handle this." The students sat on edge, their eyes darting between the professor and Clint. But Clint, he simply sighed. A slow, deep exhale. Not in frustration, not in nervousness, but in something else entirely. Something unreadable. He didn't rise right away. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his fingers lacing together as he studied the problem from a distance. Internally, Clint knew what was happening. This wasn't about calculus anymore. It wasn't about logic or numbers. It was about power, about control. The professor had seen someone he deemed lesser stand toe-to-toe with him, and he couldn't accept it. He needed to put Clint in his place. Clint had seen this before, in Hollywood, in the military, in life. People who held their power like a weapon always feared losing it the most. He let the silence hang heavy in the air, let the tension stretch just long enough. Then he stood. The room collectively inhaled. With slow, deliberate steps, Clint approached the board once more. He didn't snatch the marker from the tray like the professor had, didn't make a show of it. Instead, he picked it up with ease, turning to examine the problem up close. The professor crossed his arms, smirking, waiting for the hesitation, the self-doubt, the inevitable failure. But Clint didn't hesitate. He didn't second-guess. His hand moved again, steady, confident. The marker glided across the board, breaking down the monstrous equation into digestible, methodical steps. The students leaned in. They weren't just watching anymore. They were learning. One by one, Clint tackled the complexities, untangling the professor's web of intellectual arrogance with quiet precision. The tension in the room shifted, morphing into something electric. And then, just like before, he reached the final answer. He set the marker down, stepped back, turned, and locked eyes with the professor. The man's smirk was gone. His face had drained of color. He turned, scanning the board, desperate to find a mistake. But there was none. It was correct. It was flawless. A beat passed, then another. The students couldn't hold back anymore. Someone let out a low whistle. Another stifled a laugh. And then, like a dam breaking, the murmurs erupted. "Wait, he actually did it? There's no way. This is insane." The professor's jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. His hands balled into fists. And Clint? He just gave a small nod, as if to say, "Are we done here?" But the professor wasn't finished. No, humiliation wasn't an easy pill to swallow. He turned sharply, voice tight, with forced amusement. Well, maybe you do know a thing or two. But let's be honest, Mr. Eastwood," he said, his smirk returning in a desperate grasp at control. Math isn't just about solving problems, it's about understanding them, explaining them. He stepped closer, his voice lowering. So tell me, can you prove why your answer is correct? The room went still again. This was a different challenge. Solving was one thing, but proving why, breaking down the mathematical reasoning behind each step, was another entirely. The students looked at Clint expectantly, waiting, unsure if this was finally the moment he'd stumble. Clint held the professor's gaze. Then, with the same quiet confidence, he turned back to the board. And he began to explain. Slowly, methodically, he broke it down. Not just the numbers, but the reasoning, the logic, the flow. He spoke in a low, steady tone, not hurried, not rattled. And as he spoke, something incredible happened. The students understood. The way Clint framed the solution, the way he articulated each step, it clicked in a way their professor never made it click before. The murmurs stopped, replaced with wide eyes and nods. The professor took a step back, then another. His face burned, his authority slipping with every passing second. And Clint? He finished with one final sentence. Quiet, measured. You don't have to make something complicated just to prove you're smarter than everyone else. The professor stiffened. And the students? They cheered. The room was electric. The students, once passive observers, were now leaning forward, hanging on to every word, every number Clint scrawled onto the board. The professor, his arms crossed tightly, stood rigid, his face an unreadable mask. But his clenched jaw and twitching fingers told another story. Clint had not only solved the problem, he had done what no one expected. He explained it better than the professor himself. And then it happened. One student, a quiet girl in the back, hesitantly raised her hand. Professor, I think I finally understand this now. The professor's head snapped toward her. His lips parted, as if about to say something, anything, to regain control. But before he could, another student spoke. Yeah. Why didn't you ever explain it like that? A ripple of murmurs spread across the room. Others nodded in agreement. The shift was undeniable. The authority in the room had moved. And then, the final blow. A voice, clear, unshaken. I thought you said he didn't belong here. The words cut through the tension like a blade. The students turned their eyes back to the professor, the weight of the accusation settling between them. He had tried to humiliate Clint, to make a joke out of him. But now, standing before a room full of students who had just learned more in 10 minutes than they had all semester, he was the one exposed. The professor let out a forced chuckle, though there was no humor in it. Well, he said, shifting uncomfortably, perhaps Mr. Eastwood has a hidden talent. But Clint wasn't done. He turned, slow and deliberate, and met the professor's gaze head-on. His voice, when he spoke, was steady, calm, but laced with something colder. It's not hidden, Clint said. You just never bothered to look. The words hung in the air, heavy, undeniable. The professor blinked. His mouth opened, then closed. There was nothing left to say, and in that moment, Clint saw it. The man who had stood so tall, so sure of his own superiority, had just realized the truth. His power had never been knowledge. It had been intimidation, arrogance. And now, in front of everyone, stripped of that illusion, he was just another man. The students shifted, waiting, expecting Clint to say more, to deliver a final crushing blow, but he didn't need to. He simply set the marker down, gave one last look at the professor, and walked away. The silence in the lecture hall lingered long after Clint walked out. The students exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of awe and quiet realization. The professor, still standing at the front of the room, looked as if the ground beneath him had shifted. His authority, once unquestioned, had been dismantled in a matter of minutes, not by force, not by arrogance, but by undeniable truth. Outside, Clint took a slow breath, feeling the crisp afternoon air fill his lungs. He hadn't come here looking for a fight. He never did. But something about the professor's smugness, his need to belittle, had triggered something in Clint. A reminder of all the times men like that had mistaken quiet for weakness. A voice broke through his thoughts. "Mr. Eastwood." He turned to see a small group of students hurrying after him, their faces alight with curiosity, admiration, even gratitude. One of them, the girl who had spoken up earlier, hesitated before speaking. "That was incredible," she said, almost breathless. "No one's ever put him in his place like that before." Clint shook his head. "I didn't put him anywhere. He did that himself." Another student, a young man with glasses, frowned thoughtfully. "I just don't get it. Why was he so threatened by you?" Clint let out a low chuckle. "Some people build their whole world on the idea that they're the smartest person in the room. When that gets challenged, they don't know what to do." The group nodded, absorbing his words. The girl, still looking at Clint with something close to admiration, spoke again. "I used to think I wasn't smart enough for this class," she admitted. "The way he teaches, it makes you feel small, like you'll never get it. But the way you explain that problem—" She shook her head. It made sense. For the first time, it actually made sense. Clint studied her for a moment, then smiled, a small, knowing smile. "Math isn't about making people feel stupid," he said. "It's about making the world make sense." A beat of silence passed. Then the girl's face broke into a grin. The tension that had hung over the group dissipated, replaced by something lighter, something hopeful. Clint gave them a small nod, then turned to go. But just as he stepped forward, another voice called out, "Wait." The professor stood at the entrance of the hall, his expression unreadable. He hesitated for only a second before stepping forward. "I owe you an apology," he said stiffly, as if the words were foreign on his tongue. "I misjudged you." Clint met his gaze, neither gloating nor angry, just calm, measured. "I'm not the one you need to apologize to," he said simply, gesturing toward the students. The professor stiffened, his pride still clinging to him. But when he glanced at the students, at their expectant, almost defiant stares, something shifted in his face. For the first time, he looked uncertain. Clint didn't wait for an answer. He'd done what he came to do. He turned and walked away, the echo of his boots fading into the distance. Behind him, the students remained, their perspectives changed, their confidence renewed. And the professor? Well, some lessons take time to sink in. As Clint walked away from the lecture hall, the air felt lighter, the weight of confrontation replaced with something more profound, clarity. He had seen men like that professor before, people who wielded intellect as a weapon rather than a tool for understanding. But today, Clint hadn't just exposed arrogance. He had reminded those students that knowledge wasn't about dominance. It was about discovery. For years he had learned to pick his battles, to let ignorance roll off his back like dust from a long road. But this time, something had told him to stand firm, to speak, not for himself, but for the ones who sat in silence. doubting their worth. As he reached the campus gates, he heard footsteps behind him. The young woman from before caught up, her breath uneven. "Mr. Eastwood," she called, her voice steadier than before. "I just wanted to say thank you. Not just for what you did, but for what you said." Clint turned, offering her a small nod. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "Just remember, you don't have to be the loudest in the room to be the smartest." She smiled, a genuine, bright smile. And in that moment, he saw it, the shift, the change. She stood taller now, more sure of herself. That was the real victory. As she turned back toward the hall, Clint took one last look at the campus behind him. The professor would likely recover, find a way to rationalize what had happened. Some men never changed, but others, like that girl, like those students, had been given something they might never have had before: permission to question, to challenge, to believe in their own intelligence. With a final glance, Clint adjusted his coat and stepped into the city streets. The lesson had been taught, and maybe, just maybe, it had been learned. This story isn't just about a professor's arrogance or Clint Eastwood's quiet brilliance. It's about the power of knowledge and the courage to stand against intellectual elitism. How often do we see intelligence used as a tool for humiliation rather than enlightenment? How many times have people been dismissed simply because they didn't fit the mold of what smart is supposed to look like? Clint's response wasn't just about proving a point. It was about proving that wisdom isn't defined by arrogance and that true intelligence is measured by humility and understanding. So, what do you think? Have you ever witnessed someone underestimate another, only to be proven wrong? Have you ever felt dismissed or belittled because of who you are or where you come from? Share your thoughts in the comments, because sometimes the best lessons come from the most unexpected places.